Hi, 10th. What a treat for me to be able to share in this weekend's message. Before I do, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our 10th communities, from UBC and Kitsilano to East Vancouver to Mount Pleasant and our evening service community. I'm so glad that you have joined with us for this online service. And a special welcome to those of you who are new to 10th Online. We're thrilled that you are here with us as a part of this service. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to go hiking with a group of friends to a place called the Catamount Cave. And it is this natural mountain cave nestled in the heart of the Alberta Rockies. And if you've ever gone caving, if you've ever been in a mountain cave, you know what an unforgettable experience it is. I remember being there and with friends and navigating in the early time that we were there. Near the mouth of the cave, there's lots of natural light that streams in, and we were taking in this magnificent place and all its uniqueness. And then we decided to press in deeper and deeper into the cave. And then everything changed. It got really dark, really fast. And my headlamp wasn't of much use. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and it got cold. And it felt damp in that cave. And here we were in the heart of this mountain, and there was kind of an eerie feeling in there. And I started to feel really uncomfortable. And I wondered, what else lives in this cave? What else lives in this cave that I can't see? An unfamiliar and uncomfortable place. I had to get out of there, get out of the darkness. A cave is a fun place to visit, but you don't want to stay there too long. And it seems to me that we are living in a time where we're in a place that is totally unfamiliar to us in this cultural moment. And it is uncomfortable. And for many, it's dark. Speaking of living in a cave, I chatted with a friend last week who told me that he lives alone, and because he was feeling some symptoms, he decided to self-isolate, and then his aging parents got sick, and they just didn't want to risk anything. And so he was in his place for a month. And FaceTime and Zoom just doesn't cut it. And he felt so isolated. It was agonizing for him to be in that place. Or I heard a story of a college student who was so looking forward to this spring because she's graduating. Such a bright future ahead of her. And yet, in the new reality of COVID-19 world, with the global economy collapsing, her job prospects are now bleak. She feels a sense of hopelessness. She feels depressed when she thinks about her massive student debt. Or what about the experience of seniors, some in our own community, who are feeling afraid and isolated, some without computers or internet, or parents who work from home. And they're trying to work and parent, and they feel like they're failing at both of them. Now, I know that not everyone is experiencing this time as a dark season. Some of you are getting along quite well and even enjoying this new season. But I think we can all admit that it is a different place that we're in. A place we've never been. Who's been through a global pandemic before? Or maybe, like me, you're just growing exhausted of all the mental energy required in this new COVID-19 world. It dominates the news, and we see it everywhere when we go to the grocery store. We're just tired of it all. We want it to be over. We are grieving the little losses of all kinds of comforts and schedules and freedoms. What do we do when we find ourselves in a place that is unfamiliar and uncomfortable? How do we respond? And maybe more to the point, how do we meet God in this unique place? Well, today we're beginning a new series here at 10th, and it's called Meeting God in Isolation. And we're going to be looking at stories from the scripture of people who found themselves isolated in an unusual place, in a difficult place, and how they encountered the true living God. And today, our text comes from Psalm 57. It is a text, a psalm that was written, get this, in a cave. When David was going through a very dark season, a season that was totally unfamiliar. His whole world had changed, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. In Psalm 57, we read this: "Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." Fitting words. "I'm in the midst of lions," says David. "I'm forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path." David is articulating with emotional transparency the situation that he's in. A little bit of context here. As you know, David is this towering figure in the Old Testament. And when he was young, he was the ultimate rising star in Israel, the ultimate up-and-comer. He was the giant slayer. He was chosen to be the next king of Israel. He was universally loved. Men admired him, women adored him. If People magazine existed in those days, David's face would have been on the cover issue after issue. And things seemed to be coming all together nicely for David. He was even invited to play music for the king to soothe his troubled thoughts and spirits. And David enjoys the protection and provision of the king. He's given the King Saul's daughters hand in marriage. It's all coming together so perfectly. And then everything changes for David. One day, an arrow flies by his face, narrowly missing him, thrown by King Saul. You thought you had a difficult boss to work for. See, not everyone loved David. Saul didn't. Saul viewed him as a rival and was consumed with jealousy. He was paranoid, and thus began a time where King Saul hunted David. Scholars tell us that this hunting, this pursuit by King Saul lasted, get this, 7 years. Can you imagine being on the run for 7 years? And David goes from enemy territory to small town to wilderness until he finally lands in a dark and a cold cave, which is where he writes Psalm 57. He went from free man to fugitive, from hero to hunted. Everything has changed for David. And these words help us. They speak to us and they speak for us when we're in a season where everything has changed. I wonder how many of you sit and reflect for a moment of how the world has changed over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Maybe you'd say, 4 or 5 weeks ago, I had a job. I had a steady income. Things were good, and now everything has been turned around. Friends, in this place, David's words speak to us, and I believe they invite us to 2 things. I want to share these 2 insights from Psalm 57. The first is I believe that Psalm 57 is an invitation to do this, to practice lament. To practice lament. What is lament? Lament is the cry of our soul. The cry of pain, of anguish, of disappointment, of frustration, with as much emotional transparency as we can muster. Lament is praying our suffering. When you hurt your body, you stub your toe, you break your arm, You cry out in pain. You cry out with your voice. That's normal. That's healthy. And when your soul is wounded, it is also healthy, we learn from the Psalms, to cry that pain out. That cry is called lament. Listen to David's words. I'm in the midst of lions. I'm forced to dwell among ravenous beasts. You know, I've talked to some parents who, when they think about working at home, they may want to pray these words. I am forced to dwell among ravenous beasts. And if that's what's on your heart, then you are invited to pray that. David says, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. In another psalm, a parallel psalm, when David's in a difficult spot, listen to what he says. How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? Do you hear the emotion and the struggle and the wrestling? This is what it looks like to practice lament. What is it that has changed in your life that you are being invited to lament? Things that are big and small and everything in between. Sometimes we believe that God just wants to hear our praise. He just wants to hear expressions of gratitude. And of course, that is part of our relationship with God, but God invites us to be honest. Can you imagine a friendship where you were only allowed to say nice things? It would be a pretty shallow relationship, wouldn't it? And so it is with our faith, that God is inviting us to get in touch with what our experience is, to not sanitize it or edit it, but to pray it, to express it to God. You know, over these past few weeks, I've been thinking about some of the things that I've been lamenting, both big and small. I remember one day hearing about a former coworker I worked with at another church who was in the hospital with COVID-19. And she ended up succumbing to that horrible virus. And it shook me. It really shook me. It became less of a news story and more of a personal reality. And it really rocked me to think about what this family was experiencing. And I'm lamenting lots of maybe smaller things. I'm lamenting a trip to Israel with some folks from 10th that was canceled, where I hopefully would have got a chance to visit this cave that we're talking about in Psalm 57. And I'm lamenting some of the loss of structure in my life and in our family. I'm lamenting a trip that I was planning to go see my dad, who's journeying with Alzheimer's, and to be able to provide some support for my mom. And I don't know when I'm going to be able to get there. I'm lamenting that my daughter's grade 12 graduation is coming up, and that she got her dress and was so looking forward to it. And now, like so many other things, it's been postponed, suspended, maybe canceled. I've been learning about lament from another friend whose husband has cancer. And for the first time in her life, she is practicing lament. She says, anger is not something that I was able to express in my family growing up, but I've learned to get in touch with the feelings of disappointment and frustration and anger that I have, and to release that, to present that to God, to not bury it or ignore it. We're pretty good at doing that, aren't we? We just bury our pain in work or in distraction or in a pint of ice cream. And my friend was telling me that it has provided relief, a kind of surprising, soothing effect as she has taken time to write out prayers of lament. And even this past week, when she got to the hospital for her husband's cancer treatment and she wasn't allowed in because of COVID-19, and that spiked both of their anxiety. Friends, it occurs to me that lament is one of the most appropriate things that we can do in this season. Can I invite you today, later this week, to take time to practice lament? Maybe that's writing in a journal or going for a walk and getting in touch with some of the losses, some of the pain, some of the uncertainty or the anxiety that you're feeling, and present that to God. Maybe it would help to share that in the presence of another trusted friend. Or is it that you're called to practice lament? And second, I believe that this psalm helps us and invites us to practice something else, and that is to practice hope. To practice hope. Wait a minute. You just told me to practice lament. Now you're telling me to practice hope. Aren't those opposites? Not at all. In fact, in the Psalms, we see that those go together, that they're sister practices. That when we are authentic before God about the true condition of our hearts and the pain and the frustration and the loss, whatever that looks like, when we lament before God, it leads us to hope in God. Listen how David responds with hope. Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me. In you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until this disaster has passed. Friends, we all take refuge in something. In a time of crisis and uncertainty, a time that is so unfamiliar, we all run to something. What is it that you are running to? Someone has said, if you want to know who or what your God is, think about what you run to first to be safe, to feel secure, what you run to for comfort. And David is saying, I know exactly where to run. I know exactly where to put my hope. It is in the living God. It is in him that I take refuge. David is running from Saul, but he is clearly running to God. David is fully aware of the dangers before him, of how dangerous Saul is, of how big this problem is. Saul is big, but David declares, but God is bigger. A worldwide pandemic is huge. The economic ramifications are massive. And yet, we have a chance to declare our hope, to practice hope, to remember that as big as that is, God is bigger. Hope in the scriptures is not primarily, at least doesn't start with a feeling, but a decision of where to direct our trust. And we have a chance to direct our trust to the living God. We're living in a time where we feel like we don't have very much control over our lives. We all love control, don't we? Myself included. In fact, in our home, I make sure when we're watching TV that I hold the remote control because I like control. Of course, my wife and kids pick all of the shows and I just do what they ask me to do, but I still hold on to that remote because I like control. And we're living in a time where we feel like we've lost control. I'm reminded of this little toy that many toddlers have. If you have a child in your life, maybe he or she has one of these. It's a little plastic steering wheel. And of course, what happens is that the child takes this little steering wheel in the back seat, in their car seat, and as mom or dad are driving around, the child is pretending to drive on that steering wheel, and there's a little horn and all kinds of buttons that they can press. And the child really believes that they are in control of the car. And there comes a moment when they get a little bit older, a disappointing moment, no doubt, when they realize that, wait a minute, I turned left here and the car is still going straight. Maybe I'm not in control of this after all. And friends, it strikes me that many of us are in that place where we're realizing that control is an illusion. that our lives feel out of control and we feel disoriented and we can panic. Is anybody in control? And here's where we remind ourselves that the living God is in control, that God still reigns and rules over the universe, that God's purposes and plans are not hijacked even by a global pandemic, but that God's purposes for me will not be stopped. David says, I cry out to God Most High, who fulfills his purpose for me. Friends, the reason that we can practice hope is because we know that God is still fulfilling his purposes for the world. He's still fulfilling his purposes for me. We can also be filled with hope. We can practice hope when we remember that some of God's greatest work, when some of God's most spectacular work happens in a cave. Scholars tell us that this time that David spent, these years, which were no doubt painful, proved to be some of the richest years of his life. It was a time where David learned to pray like never before. It was a time where David learned to trust like never before. A time where David learned to practice hope in the living God. So, what does this look like to practice lament, to practice hope? I'm going to invite a friend and colleague, Melissa Ewing, our family pastor, to come and share with us an experience about meeting God in a cave. Melissa.
Thank you, Jade. A little over a month ago, as the world was shutting down, many of us were feeling very anxious and very scared, especially if we were getting sick. As we were making the decision here at 10th Church to shut our services down, I found myself getting sick. Started with a sore throat, and then a headache, and then a fever and chills. Before I knew it, I was coughing, and it started to go into my lungs. So I called my doctor, and my doctor said, you better get tested. It sounds like COVID-19. So I got tested, and they told me that you need to go home, and you need to go into your room as if it's a cave and not interact with anybody in your house. So I went home, shut the door away from Jay, my husband, and my daughters, Ada and Claire, and I got into bed. And I had to stay in there until 14 days passed from my initial symptoms or until I got a negative test result. So the first couple of days was mostly sleeping. I didn't feel like it was like any other flu that I ever had. It was a normal sickness, and I slept, and the days went by quickly. But then I started to get better. And as I got better, the isolation became more and more difficult. I started calling the CDC COVID-19 results line, and I couldn't get through. I started calling every 20 or 30 minutes, couldn't even leave a message. I was feeling helpless and anxious, and I had no control over the situation I was in. At what point, my daughter Claire got hurt, and I could hear her in the living room. She was crying, and she was calling out, "Mom, I just want a hug from Mom." The most difficult thing as a parent is when your child is crying and you can't go and help them. Talk about feeling helpless. So then I started watching the news. And the more I watched the news, the more anxious and fearful I became. So then I started to avoid it by watching lots of Netflix, like many of us are probably doing right now. But I noticed that I was getting into this cycle, feeling anxious and fearful and out of control and helpless, and then numbing it with Netflix. And this could have gone on the whole time I was in isolation. So I decided to make a choice and invite God into the cave with me. I prayed, I journaled, I tried to listen to him, and God did speak, but he didn't speak in the way that I hoped he would speak. You see, I've been in a bit of a difficult time, a disappointing season in life, I suppose. I'm not going to go into details, but what I thought would happen at this point in my life hasn't happened. Expectations that I had for what I would be doing haven't quite panned out the way that I thought it would pan out. And so I've done the things that I found myself doing in isolation, except slightly different. I was avoiding the problem by being busy. I work full time. I'm married to a pastor who also works full-time. We have 2 kids. We're busy. I was digging into exercising and eating healthy, and I was increasing my spiritual practices. I was reading my Bible more and praying more, and this should have made everything better. But what it was doing, it was masking over the fact that I actually wasn't okay. The fear, the anxiety, the helplessness that peaked during my isolation was there long before COVID-19. I had just been avoiding it. So I invited God into the cave. And what I realized is that God was already in the cave with me. I didn't see it. I didn't recognize him because I was expecting him to come through in a different way. I wanted him to make me feel better. I wanted him to take it all away and just inject me with a little bit of hope. But what God wanted to do was sit with me while I felt the disappointment and felt the loss and felt the grief, and then voice the disappointment and voice the loss and voice the grief. You know, as a pastor, I've talked to people before saying, you can voice your disappointment to God, and you should do this. He's so much bigger than your disappointment. He can handle it. And if you don't, you're going to feel resentful. But what I realized is that I had not voiced my disappointment to God. 12 days after I first got sick, 8 days into my isolation, I finally got my test results back, and they were negative. I did not have COVID-19. I just had some other flu that made me feel like I had COVID-19. But I was still in isolation for 8 days. 8 days by myself, but I wasn't alone. God was with me. I'd like to say that God has restored my soul and everything is great now, but that isn't the case. Instead, God has given me quite literally homework. I have an assignment to do while I'm at home. And I can choose to avoid the assignment or I can choose to lean into it. So I'm choosing to lean into it, and this is what it looks like. First, I practice lament. I have my prayer time in the morning, but I've altered my routine a little bit. I'm very real and I'm very honest, and I'm doing a lot of journaling. And in my journal, I'm doing things like this. I'm naming the things that I'm disappointed in. Like, God, I trusted you, but I feel like you let me down. I ask the unanswerable questions. God, where were you when this happened? Why did you let me go through this? I cry out my need. I can't do this without you, God. I need you to rescue me. And I will continue to go deeper into the cave of lament until the season of lament is over. But this isn't the only part of my assignment. There's a part 2, and it involves choosing hope. Choosing hope is hard at first. That's why it's called choosing. It's not a feeling that you can manufacture. So this is how I started. I started looking in my journal and flipping through to the times where God answered my prayer, to the time he provided for my need, to the time that his plans seemed to work out so much better than my own plans. And as I started looking through my journal, hope was springing up. God did it once before. I'm going to believe that he can and he will do it again. And then during the days when I feel like my anxiety or my fear is starting to spike, I just pause. And I pray this little prayer, a little breath prayer. In you I trust. I breathe in. In you I trust. In you I trust. And I feel myself calming as my posture changes from fear to trust. And when I find myself asking one of the biggest unanswerable questions, how long? God, how long will this go on? I remember something really important. I remember something just coming off of Easter about how Jesus died on the cross on Good Friday, and then he was laid to rest in a tomb that was literally a cave. And then he was risen again. He rose again 3 days later. As Jade mentioned before, God does his most spectacular work in a cave. And as I remember this, I find myself audaciously, tentatively, desperately asking God, could it be that you are doing your most spectacular work in me that you've done yet? And this feels like the most important question. This is the question that allows me to fully enter into lament with courage, but this is also the question that allows me to choose hope over and over again.
Thank you, Melissa, for sharing so honestly about what it looks like to encounter God in the cave. And I love that refrain that God does his most spectacular work in the cave. And as we come out of Easter, as Melissa alluded to, we're reminded that Jesus placed in a tomb, a cave. It was supposed to be a symbol of death, of a terrible ending, of the loss of every dream, and yet it's been transformed into a symbol of hope, that there is hope even in the darkness. Let me conclude by inviting you to reflect on two questions. This is something you can write down, perhaps share with others, perhaps that can be a part of your week's internal dialogue as you think this through. But even now, in a posture of prayer, where is it that you are being invited to lament? To be as honest as you can about what the season looks like for you. And if it's doubt or it's anger or it's frustration, what is it that you need to begin to express to God? Take a moment to now reflect on that question. And secondly, what would it look like for you to begin to practice, or as Melissa said, to choose hope? To in some way renew your deep hope in the living God. To recognize that as big and as challenging as things are before you, that you have a chance today to renew your hope in God. To say, God, I want to run to you. I want to find my refuge in you. I come to you for security, for comfort. You're my refuge. Take a moment to express that now to God in prayer. So, living God, thank you that you meet us right where we're at. For those in our community who are in isolation, in darkness, in fear, in anxiety, may you meet them in that very place. And for those who are not in a bad place, not in a challenging or difficult place, but are also coming to terms with just how different their lives look, what is this new normal? Would you meet us in that very place? And may this time be a time we look back on and say, God did some of his most miraculous, most spectacular work. I learned to pray and trust like never before. May that be so in Christ's name. Amen.